Now, I'm going to, at this time, share my screen. Okay, it did work. Okay, great.
Yeah.
These are the proofs of my newest book coming out with Whiff Stock imminently. The proofs have already been approved by me, so to speak, and they've already been signed off on. But the printing press, the actual printer, although these are the proofs and this is what the book will look like, the printing press is on hold right now because of the pandemic. So, I'm not going to get an actual physical paperback until they decide to go back to work. But nevertheless, it is entitled Evolution, Secular or Sacred, written by Bradford, myself, and also with the foreword by Thomas J. Ord. Okay. Now, I'm going to go over the contents here quickly, and then I'll move into the introduction. The first part I've presented to y'all before, I do believe, regarding the secular evolutionary worldview. I think I've presented on that before. This is a revised version of that based on some critiques that I've had from you and from Dr. Clayton and from other people. But nevertheless, I look to introduce it and critique it in the first chapter. It's a programmatic essay for the remainder of the book. Part 2 is composed of 3 chapters. 1, Dialogues with Charles Sanders Peirce, Evolutionary Developmental Teleology, and Kenotic Causation. Those evolutionary developmental teleology is my own wording, and kenotic causation is my own wording as well. And then I go into Alfred North Whitehead, Chance, and the Eminently Creative Spirit, which has been published in Zygon. In Zygon, right? Thirdly, if Robin was here, she would recognize my essay on chapter 4 immediately. The third chapter in part 2, or that is chapter 4, regards Derrida and non-human animals, an exploration of shared animality, rather. I delivered that to Dr. Min back, I think it was last fall. Was that right? I can't remember, but maybe it was fall of 18. I can't recollect precisely. But nevertheless, moving into part 3, which regards theological perspectives on evolution and divine involvement or activity, that is a suggestion by Ingolf Dalford that I sort of reference the same thing but using a more common terminology. It's sort of like the imbibition that we spoke of earlier. Perhaps I'll incorporate that imbibition to reference my own word, imbibification, so as to make it more understandable or what have you. I'm not sure. But nevertheless, in this part 3, I start with chapter 5, the God of Chance and Purpose, moving thereafter into Augustine's theologies of creation, simultaneous creation, seminal seeds in Genesis 1 through 3. In the next chapter 7, I move into non-dualistic macroevolution, an exercise in mystical immanence and divine involvement in the evolutionary world. Then I follow that up by a very provocative chapter in evolutionary Christology, adoptionism and Jesus of Nazareth. Moving into part 4, which regards theological perspectives on evolution and responsive divine love, I note firstly the connection between kenosis and emergence. Then I move into one of 2 chapters focusing on an explication of Thomas J. Ord's theology of love, theology of uncontrolling love. I first introduce it by referencing Ord in contradistinction to Anders Nygren, who was a giant on love in the previous century. Okay, and I compare and contrast Ord with Nygren. And then in the 11th chapter, I sort of take the same basic material. No, I shouldn't say that, but I sort of take what I alluded to earlier with Ord and expand it into my own proposition of necessary, canonically donated, and self-giving love. Moving on. I will note here the dedication because I love this man. This man has made a tremendous influence on my life. I dedicate this book to Professor Arthur Tyson from Middle Georgia State University. I first encountered Dr. Tyson back in 1996, my first semester of college. Well, he put me in this introductory biology class my first semester of college, and I was blown away. At this time, I barely knew how to read and write because of my traumatic brain injury, and I barely knew how to read and write. So I was thrust into that situation with introductory biology my first semester of college, and it hammered me. It floored me. It took me by surprise. I was not prepared for it. That made me question the I guess the possibility of entering high school again, because I was blown away. I Because my TBI happened in '95. I missed the first half of the year of my senior year, and then I came back in '96, the first part of '96, and entered alternative school where we essentially just goofed off, to tell you the truth, right? I mean, that's just the truth of the matter. But I got caught back up with my work, and then I walked with my class in graduating in what, April or May '96, right? But I shouldn't have walked then. The only reason why I did, I submit, is because the person driving my truck was the assistant superintendent's son. You know, and so I had friends in high places and so forth like that, if that makes sense to you. But regardless, getting back to Dr. Tyson, the way that he taught us by giving vivid and stimulating lectures left an indelible mark with me, and it did. I've never taken an exam that's more difficult than his. He required critical thought and the understanding of concepts, not mere rote memorization. And for that, I'm a better man for it, indeed. He was a very compassionate person, a very rigorous teacher as well. And I needed both of those things in my life at that time. Indeed, I did. In no small way, I can honestly say that he forever reoriented my trajectory in life. Again, and that for the better. What more can be said for or even expected of a teacher than to influence a person's life? I mean, it's like an inflection point with my life. Yes, I like that, because if you look at a stock graph, the inflection point is when the graph changes directions going down or up. He was an inflection point on my life, because thereafter my life was committed to biology in some sense or fashion. So then, while everything I've written in this book, I'm sure he will not agree with, nevertheless, the foundation for higher critical thought that he bestowed to me and in me made it possible. And then I end. There was an African American girl in our class at that time. Indeed, she often referred to him as Mr. Dr. Tyson. And that stuck with me, right? Mr. Dr. Tyson, you know, because she was trying to be most polite, you know, what have you. And that was probably her first semester in college too. So she didn't know how to refer to, and neither did I, but I mean, she didn't know how to refer to to a professor, I guess, in the proper way. So she said, Mr. Dr. Tyson, and that stuck with me. Right. So I point that out there at the end of the dedication. Right. I'm going to move now into the foreword by Thomas J. Ord. Bradford McCall says we've got it all wrong. That is, we've been thinking about God and evolution the wrong way. And this has not led to much progress. Wrong thinking rarely leads to much good. Theists worried about evolution have been thinking about evolution in the wrong way. McCall encourages believers to read the evolutionary story through a different theological lens than many have been reading it heretofore. Instead of thinking of God, or rather, instead of thinking God as a distant architect or controlling micromanager, what if we read evolution in light of a God of love? What if this God's love is creative, relational, and uncontrolling? McCall's project is not some cursory idea thrown up without support. This book is not fluff unsubstantiated by in-depth analysis. Rather, McCall dives headlong into the details. He explores and evaluates proposals from the leading philosophers, scientists, and theologians of our day. And he explores many from yesteryear. He faces challenges without flinching. The loving God described here is present with us in all of creation. This God is immanent in the working of the world, including evolution. But being present and active in evolution does not mean that the world exactly reflects what God desires. This lens of love proposal overcomes the primary objections by anti-evolutionary voices. And yet the God McCall offers for our consideration is no whimper creature. While McCall draws from and is influenced by a myriad of relevant voices, this book offers novel proposals too. In many ways, it integrates the best of various disciplines and theories. Innovation emerges when drawing together the many into the one. This work is courageous and much needed. It is intellectually robust and interdisciplinary. I'm convinced by these arguments. I'm especially drawn to McCall's vision of divine love at work in the world of evolution. I suspect some scholars in philosophy and science will be skeptical when first hearing the idea that a loving God creates without controlling. But McCall lays out a robust foundation for this claim. And theologians worried about his view will find McCall up to the task of defending its merits. Near the end of the 20th century, Emery Lakatos, I'm not sure about that. I know the name, but I know the person, but I can't pronounce it. I'm from South Georgia, by the way. I mutilate everything. But nevertheless, Emery Lakatos famously argued and explored the scientific method. He proposed what he called research programs, which attempted to place up their philosophical assumptions at the fore. Scholars at the science and theology interface have used this approach to find frameworks for their profoundly important work, but it remains controversial insofar as the disagreement about what is philosophical and theological, that is what should be embraced. This book might be understood as providing a McCall research program, and I am for one impressed with the fruitful framework and winsome proposals that Bradford McCall offers. Boom, said the dynamite. Yeah, right. I love that. He increased my sales by manifold numbers by having that introduction or that forward. Nevertheless, moving on into the meat of my presentation today. This is my introduction to the book. So then, is evolution secular or sacred? Are the processes of evolution endowed with meaning? Admittedly, I cannot, do not, and will not assert that the evolutionary process provides proof for God, for that is a natural theological enterprise, not something I'm involved in here. John Halt, however, has noted that events in life can be seen or read from multiple perspectives. I agree with such a contention. Since I concede this notion, I will be attempting to read the processes of evolution. Indeed, I will herein and do elsewhere contend that the processes of evolution can be read in a manner that is consistent, key term, with the notion of God, particularly with the notion of a God who somehow, more upon this later, interacts with the natural world in a creative, responsively loving, and uncontrolling manner. This argument will proceed over 11 chapters. In what directly follows, I'll proffer an overview of sorts of the remainder of the title. In the first chapter, which serves as a programmatic essay for the remainder of the volume, I explicate the secular evolutionary worldview in light of various strengths and weaknesses that I perceive in such a worldview. The chapter is centered around two individuals, Michael Roos of Florida State University and Elliot Sober of University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have selected these two representatives of the secular evolutionary worldview to focus upon, for though they be secular evolutionists, they are not belligerently anti-spiritual advocates of the view. Indeed, I have chosen them in part because they offer a very nuanced and sustained, though not vociferous, critique of the worldview that I, and many of my readers also, hold so dear, that is, theism broadly defined. At the onset of this chapter, I proffer a definition of the terminology regarding worldview, and then elucidate several, almost a dozen in fact, aspects and theses of this worldview that I distinctly define as secular, including the notion of progress, the roles and entanglements of adaptation and adaptationism, selection and selectionism, and adaptation and adaptionism with the sub-theses of natural and sexual selection and the unit of selection problem, which corresponds, or let's just say, which has corresponding sub-theses of the individual versus group selection debate, which is also explicatable, so to speak, by the altruism subtopic. Within chapter 2, which begins part 2 of this title, covering philosophical perspectives on evolution, I argue that Charles Sanders Peirce's teleology is more than a mere purposive pursuit of a predetermined end. Rather, it is a developmental teleology. Peirce's developmental teleology is applicable to his idea of teleology in general, I contend. Thus, final causes evolve, and they are not static. Peirce's view pictures teleology as an evolving process, and is to be seen as a general goal versus having a definite end state or goal predetermined, which is the corollary, I contend, to the uncontrolling love of God. Teleology, it must be recognized, emerged out of the increasing complexification of life on earth, and continues to be general, not specific, and is conceived of herein as at least partially self-determining. In Peirce's agapism, God gives himself away in an act of uncontrolling love without any conditions regarding the potential responses to that love, as well as to what responses may fulfill that love. It is merely a display of completely reckless, overflowing love. Seen as such, the many and varied manifestations of complexity that macroevolution has given rise to can be seen as a fulfillment of the teleological goals of God. Further, the kenotic creating spirit who donates uncontrolling love to her creation is present in, with, and under the processes of biological evolution, and should be seen to act teleologically within the causal nexus of creation, that is, natural laws and later human action. A point that my Wesleyan-derived brothers and sisters should be able to promote without difficulty. In chapter 3, it is argued that God, through the Spirit, is both the immanent and the immanent principle of creativity, ever wooing and empowering the advancements and complexity within biological evolution. I argue herein also that God, particularly in and through the activity of the spirit of creativity, was fully present in, with, and under what is often called creation, from the very beginning of created time, and will be to the very end of time, proleptically present as the expression of the principle of creativity. I maintain that the Spirit, by her kenosis into the natural world, imbibed nature with an evolving fertility that has continually manifested itself in and through the increases of complexity in the natural environment. This primal imbibing of herself into the world of nature caused the world to become marked by what principally amounts to an activation of the naturally occurring inherent potentialities within nature, thereby producing a distinctive self-creativity within the world. Somewhat akin to Peirce, who said that we need a thoroughgoing evolutionism or none, I contend that we need a thoroughgoing immanent God or none. Key point. All the while noting that immanent and self-creativity are marks of the overall poetic process or poietic process known as biotic evolution. The fourth chapter covers sections of Jacques Derrida's corpus that explore the human-animal and non-human-animal binary. Indeed, in his writings, Western thought regarding the binary is examined, as well as its inherently anthropocentric framework. Derrida successfully, however, deconstructs its systems and highlights why the binary largely remains in place. He wrote more than 800 pages, I should say, explicitly devoted to the animal, most of which appeared in print only after his death, which thereby makes animality, which you wouldn't think of ordinarily, because if you're just focused with his published writings prior to his death, you wouldn't recognize this. But if you look at his posthumous publications, you'll realize that animality was one of his central concerns, one of his central philosophical themes, in fact. The human-animal, non-human-animal binary has a long philosophical history going all the way back to Aristotle, who in the history of animals established a hierarchical human-animal, non-human-animal opposition. Aristotle rightly attributes intelligence to animals, and he thought that this differs only in quantity when compared with human animals. Derrida deconstructs this binary by dissolving the perceived superiority of human animals, in part through a critique of the attributes that human animals have historically been used to separate themselves from non-human animals. Chapter 5 begins part 3, which explicates theological perspectives on evolution and divine involvement or activity. Particularly, this fifth chapter notes that in the structure of evolutionary theory, which was Gould's magnum opus, by the way, Gould emphasizes the importance of recognizing both the reality of structural constraint as well as the idea that structures have an element of historical contingency. According to him, the history of life is not progressive necessarily, and it's certainly not predictable. The Earth's living systems have evolved through a series of unexpected, unplanned, and accidental events, any one of which could have turned out differently, and thereby led evolutionary history on a pathway that possibly could not have led to the derivation of consciousness, that is, upper divisional mammals like us, and even some apes and so forth. Perhaps the most sustained critique, however, of Gould's contingency thesis has come from Simon Conway Morris. Conway Morris notes that in the phenomenon known as convergence, similar patterns appear in widely divergent or disparate groups, and he's employed such examples of convergence to argue that despite the apparent contingency, evolution is far more predictable than admitted by Gould. The sixth chapter is comprised of an essay that dialogues with Augustine's theologies of creation. It asserts that Augustine's theology of creation is a muddled mess. In fact, one would be more apropos in referring to his theologies of creation. This essay argues that his theologies of creation worked in a backwards fashion. That is, he was more correct at the onset of his extensive theological writings than he was at the end of his magnificent corpus output. Indeed, the posit of an allegorical interpretation for the days of creation, as set forth in Against the Manichees text, written very early in his theological career, was closer to the reality of the situation from our post-Darwinian perspective than his textual acrobatics, I love that, in his later writings. It is concluded rather than that with respect to Augustine's writings, one must go backwards in order to go forwards. Chapter 7 explores non-dualistic macroevolution and asserts that it is an exercise in mystical immanence and divine involvement in an evolutionary world. Whether ultimate reality is to be conceived as a personal God or an impersonal principle, somehow at work in the world, is an issue which tends to divide major world religions into opposing camps. Furthermore, even within a given religion, philosophers and theologians may differ on how God or ultimate reality is to be conceived. It is a commonplace that while Asian philosophy is non-dualistic, the West, because of its uncritical reliance on Greek-derived intellectual standards, is dualistic. Dualism is this deep-seated habit of thinking and acting in all spheres of life through the prism of binary opposites, which lead to paralyzing practical and theoretical difficulties. In general, Asian philosophy can provide assistance for the future of a Christian non-dualism, even though the West finds Asian philosophical non-dualism, especially that of that form of Buddhism, nihilistic. How do you say that?
Mahayana.
Mahayana, thank you. Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, nihilistic. However, the late postmodern, or I should say, however, late/postmodern thought may deliver us from the dualisms embedded in and embodied in modernity. Now, the 8th chapter is an admittedly provocative one that reimagines the incarnation of God through Jesus of Nazareth in terms of adoptionism. I propose therein an evolutionary Christology. Adoptionism has a long history of being promoted and suppressed throughout the Christian era. Succinctly, this essay argues that we may need to revisit this understanding of Jesus of Nazareth in order to make sense of the doctrine of God and to make it understandable and even palatable for the 21st century faith context. In its most basic form, adoptionism argues that Jesus of Nazareth was born a man like any other human. However, due to his pristine and perfect fulfillment of God the Father's will for his life, he was adopted into the Godhead, and deemed thereby worthy of dying for the mass of men and women. I propose that such an understanding of Jesus' life retains the import of his unification with humanity, all of humanity, and also honors the intentions of the church fathers to stress Jesus' uniqueness. So then, Jesus' exceptionality was once and forever cemented at his baptism by John and marked by the descent of the Spirit upon him, thereby constituting his anointing and empowering him to carry out the salvation of all who believe in him. He is thereafter pneumatologically constituted to be the Son of God. Chapter 9 begins the 4th part of this text, which explicates theological perspectives on evolution and responsive divine love. In fact, this ninth chapter explores the connections, if any, between kenosis and emergence. I begin by noting that modern advances in scientific study reveal a vastly more complicated world than the reductionist program of the late 19th and 20th centuries ever envisioned. In this essay, I seek to offer a new approach to creation, building upon the notions of emergence and kenosis. Pointedly, I proffer the notion that the existence and viability of emergence theory depends upon the primal kenotic act of God, the Spirit pouring herself into creation. I review and interact with Clayton's seminal work, Mind and Emergence. I then present the biblical basis of kenosis of the Spirit into creation, and thereafter discuss former conceptions of the science and kenosis connection. Thereafter, I make my own contribution to the connections between kenosis of the Spirit into creation and emergence theory. Chapter 10 is the first of two interrelated essays that dialogue with Thomas J. Ord's conception of the uncontrolling love of God. Both of these chapters appropriate Ord's position in different manners and in different guises. The first of the two, chapter 10, asserts a fully kenotic concept of an essentially kenotic God who has an eternal nature marked by others-centered and others-empowering uncontrolling love. This uncontrolling love, as the contingentist Ord likes to say, that's a word, by the way, that I've recently coined in this use in this book to refer to someone who emphasizes contingency in his or her philosophy of life. Nevertheless, as he likes to say, this others empowering, other-centered, uncontrolling love necessarily provides full freedom and agency to each species within the natural world, especially human animals, with God working to empower and inspire creation toward well-being and wholeness. Regardless of our attitude about religion, there is something very compelling about this radical image of self-giving as the epitome of love. One can hardly argue with it, in fact, because there's enormous power in it. In this essay, I seek to build on the insights regarding love by both Nygren and Ord, with an assist by Karol Wojtyla, who's named as such because he printed that book as Karol Wojtyla, not as Pope John Paul II. So I'm honoring the way that he printed the book. I seek further to illustrate the notion that God's canonically donated love is a synergistic symbiosis enacted through the spirit of creativity
Market data connection
that achieves greater evolutionary results that combined than either aspect of the symbiosis alone. Excuse me. That's my trading platform. Excuse me. Very well. The final constructive chapter is composed of an essay that responds to a prompt given by the Wesleyan Theological Society's 2020 call for papers just back in maybe March of this year. Right, I went and delivered this and debated Thomas J. Ord, or not debated, but actually it was sort of a love fest, so to speak, to make a pun on words. But nevertheless, I presented there, and he responded, and then we had a round of the question and answer by the attendees at the Wesleyan Theological 2020 Society, the Wesleyan Theological Society's 2020 annual meeting, rather. This prompt was related to whether or not God is necessarily loving or if he's freely loving. I dialogue herein with Thomas J. Ord, who is a giant when it comes to the exposition of Christian love. Further, I reiterate a minority position on the meaning and extrapolation of the term kenosis. That is, that the term refers to variously a kenotic donation, a self-giving, or even a self-offering, or even a self-donation. Indeed, the love to which God calls us is multidimensional and multi-expressive. As such, it takes many forms. God calls his creatures to express full-ordered love, making a play there on his name, of course, because God's love is full-orbed, which is his terminology. I agree with this terminology, but I dub it full-ordered because I just like the way that sounds better. But regardless, this canonically donated, full-ordered love onsets an evolving fertility within the natural world, which is the result of the pantheistic relationship between God and the world. This pantheistic relationship was initially wrought by the kenotic donation of God's very self into chaotic matter eons ago, and is now continually sustained and upheld by the repetitive imbibification of the creating spirit, that is, the impartation of her very self into the natural world. Thereafter, marked by the spirit of contingency within evolution, the natural world progressed in a serpentine manner into the advancement of greater complexity, of which Homo sapiens sapiens, that is our subspecies, are the pinnacle, at present anyway. Indeed. Questions?
So, are you done for the first part of your
I'm
presentation?
done for all of it.
All right. So what types of questions, besides clarification questions, do you want any other types? Obviously, this is already a book that's going to be published, right?
Right.
So you're done and it's been accepted
Yes,
as
sir.
is, right?
Yes. But you can always refine and critique it. I don't mind.
Okay.
Refine it in the next
The next
edition,
edition.
right? Yeah.
The next edition.
Right. I'm teasing there. That book will probably only sell 400 or 500 copies in its lifetime. I understand that fully. It's an academic book. That's what it's geared toward. But nevertheless.
Well, I'll tell you just a thought. I see more than one book in this book because there's various topics, some of which are tied together by the general topic of creation and evolution, how that works itself out. But they're also very specific, like Augustine is a specific topic. Derrida's views can be a specific topic. So I could see you writing other books based on this book that are more specific to individual chapters. So it's a very ambitious book. So my question is in regard to the chapter, and I have to get back to my notes because I'm out of the notes of your book. So let me get back there. What you call an admittedly provocative one, reimagining the incarnation of God through Jesus Christ in terms of adoptionism. So that could be the most controversial chapter in your whole book,
Indeed.
potentially.
I totally expect such.
Because it sounds like it goes counter to pretty much the Christology accepted by the main branches of Christendom, such as beginning with John 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him. And the Word became flesh. So it sounds like you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, in this chapter that Christ became God through adoptionism. He was actually just a human being. And then God adopted him in his adulthood for his righteous, basically, behavior and following God. And he then became divine.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So that runs really counter to Catholic and Protestant and Eastern Orthodox theology. So you're very bold. I have to commend you for your honesty and taking a bold stance with what you believe. But I think that's where it sounds a little like Teilhard de Chardin. Did you pull anything from him
No,
in your views? No. Where did you get your views on adoptionism? I guess I'm asking. I'm just looking at the summary, so I don't have any details.
Right. I could present on that at another time if you'd like such. But yes, I draw from for example, let's see, dynamic monarchism. Now, of course, dynamic monarchism was considered a heresy after Tertullian and Hippolytus and Clement of Alexandria and Origen, whatever you call it, Origen, after they wrote. But adoptionism has a long history in Christianity and as well as in Gnosticism. Indeed, it does. For example, Epiphanius in his Panarion indicates that adoption began in Rome with a man known as Theodotus the Tanner, who had originally renounced the notion that Jesus is the Son of God. However, he began to proclaim that Jesus is the Philos Anthropos, that is a mere man who received the Spirit of holiness from God in a special way at his baptism. According to Hippolytus of Rome, Theodotus taught that Jesus of Nazareth was a man born of a virgin, as the contention from the Council of Jerusalem stated, that he lived like other men of his day and was highly pious. However, at his baptism in the Jordan River, the Christ child came down upon him in the likeness of a dove. And of course, that's when the voice thundered from heaven, "This is my son, with whom I'm well pleased," my translation. Afterward, Jesus returned to the Jordan, whereupon he was led into the wilderness. Thus, after the descent of the Spirit upon him, Jesus was enabled to do mighty deeds, wonders, even dynamite, or dynamis, indeed. But these wonders only manifested themselves after the Spirit's descent upon him, which constituted the moment of adoption of the Son by God the Father. Indeed.
All right, just one follow-up question, and then I'll let other people. Is your view on adoptionism in general outline generally accepted by process theologians, or or would you call that uniquely yours? I don't fully consider Clayton totally process, for example, but some other process theologians, let's just say Thomas J. Ord, for example.
No, they did. Why am I echoing here? I don't know, but no, it's not a given position in process camp. I'm an originator in that regard, or I'm not an originator because I just draw on past history. Indeed, because before it was suppressed at the Council of Chalcedon, which was what, 372 AD, 382 AD, something like that. Chalcedon. I'm thinking before it was suppressed, it was actually an active view of God. Indeed, the adoption is somewhat base our thinking upon the Gospel of Mark to the exclusion of other Gospels. I theorize that Mark was written at a time in which the doctrines of the pre-existence of Christ and his virgin birth had not yet been ardently advocated, and hence the text of Mark does not represent this perspective, nor advocate such. However, by the time that the Gospels of Luke and Matthew had been written, Jesus is identified as the Son of God from the beginning of his life. This, of course, is not the most radical position, because in the Gospel of John, as you earlier pointed out, John, it is asserted that Jesus is the pre-existent Word of God, which existed in the beginning. Now, adoptionism denies that Jesus eternally pre-existed prior to his appearance upon earth. And although it indeed explicitly affirms the deity subsequent to the events of his life, its adherents, myself included, view Jesus as currently divine. and he has been since his adoption by the Father, although he's in no matter equal to the Father, nor to the Spirit, or whatever you want to say. Why do I say such? Well, is in numerous places. I'm thinking of, for example, John 14:28. My Father is greater than I. And then you could go back into the synoptic gospels and also find similar statements that Jesus is on a lower plane of existence than God the Father. I adhere to that. Yes.
Okay, I'll let other people ask questions because I don't want to.
I will note here quickly that this dynamic monarchian school found itself under attack by the various Logos theologians that I earlier alluded to. That is, Tertullian, Hippodulus of Rome, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen. This persecution of the adoptionist perspective increased post the pronouncement of anathema, that is heresy, by Pope Victor I in the mid-90s of the 2nd century, who himself oddly was a certified monarchian, but of the modalist variety, not of an adoptionist variety. And I could get into modalism here as well. Modalism is just simply the idea that Jesus was God on earth. God the Father pre-existed the earth. Jesus was God the Father on the earth. And then when Jesus ascended, Jesus became the Spirit. That's modalism for you. That was condemned as a heresy also. But that's different. That's different from adoptionism, because I contend that adoptionism retains the distinct linkage of Jesus with humanity. Because let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, if Jesus were divine come flesh, what he did as flesh is all divine. So he gives no I guess marker for us to base what we do upon. But if Jesus were a true son of Joseph, if you will, a true human who attained mastery of the law and also of grace and so forth like that. Of course, we have to realize that Jesus was a pure Jew. He was a Jew of Jew, right? I mean, he kept the law, etc., especially when growing up. It's only after his public manifestation as the Son of God that he start to tailor things to a Christian orientation. And of course, Paul was heavily involved in that transformation of Jesus from being a son of Mary to a son of God. Indeed, he was. Now, the Shepherd of Hermas, notably, which was written prior to almost any of the Gospels, right? Taught that Jesus of Nazareth was a virtuous man filled with the Spirit of God, and thereafter was adopted by the Father. While for some time the Shepherd of Hermas was bound with the rest of recognized scriptures, eventually it was removed from the codices that included the rest of recognized scripture, and one may safely assume that was because of its unorthodox Christology. That is its congruence with adoptionistic Christology. So after the people in charge began rigidifying doctrine, they started moving out stuff that didn't agree with their doctrine. Right. That's what I contend anyway. I think it has historical precedent as well.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I, of course, could argue the evolutionary Christology with you for like days, and we could have a lot of fun with that. But I'd rather sort of go with it for a minute and say, if that's the case, I've got two questions, and one is then, are you arguing for Jesus as more, this is kind of the minor question, in the Son of Man tradition, like the most perfect human, closest to God, that he claims for himself? And then secondarily, if Jesus was a human being, fully human and not divine until, say, his baptism, but was able to attain the favor of the Father in order to do the work that he did and to be adopted. I haven't read your whole book, so I'm just wondering if you explore what that means for other human beings. Like, are there other human beings equally divine to Jesus, having gone through the same process that A, we may not be aware of, or B, that could still come into being either now or after? You know what I'm saying? Like, is your thesis that Jesus has to be a unique person in order to attain this divinity, and that nobody else could be like that? Or given the possibility of this evolutionary Christology, could there be others? Have there been others? Might there be others? I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, I'll start with your second question first, right? I'll start with your second question first, indeed. Now, I do hold to the idea that Jesus was the Son of Man. If we go back to Ezekiel, if we go back to other Old Testament prophecies, Jesus is presented as the Son of Man. And I wish I could recollect, there's a book out by, something Christos, it's a Russian Orthodox name, so I can't pronounce it, but I'll track it down later. Nevertheless, that builds upon this Son of Man idea, going back to all the prophecies, and indicates that Jesus was the Son of Man. Now, he makes the argument that the Son of Man and the Son of God are the same, but I disagree with him there. I'll get that book later. I've got it on my shelf up there somewhere, and I'll send it out to y'all, send out the name of it to y'all. But nevertheless, no. Have there been others? Have there been other Christs? Well, I view Christ as a prophet, as fundamentally a prophet who was endowed by God through adoption to become the Son of God. Now, I believe there are other prophets. For example, Moses was a prominent prophet that revealed the will of God to mankind. Jesus came along and revealed the will of God to mankind. And then you could say, hell, Muhammad came along and revealed the will of God to mankind. I consider I consider the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to be also in the line of prophets like Moses, Jesus, and himself, Muhammad. Furthermore, I contend that if any of us are familiar with the Baha'i faith, yeah, or do we know what the Baha'i faith is? Any of us?
I've had a few students who are of that faith. So yeah.
Okay, right. Well, of course, the Bab could be considered another prophet along the lines of Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and the Bab.
But could they attain divinity? Or could a person in the future, like, is the fact that Jesus was able to, as you seem to claim, become divine,
mm-hmm.
right? Mm-hmm. Is that possible for other human beings? Or is Jesus of Nazareth unique in history in that way from your view?
That's a very interesting question. I want to, because of my conservative background, to claim that Jesus is the one and the only who could ever attain such. But does not Paul reference elsewhere, which was written all before the Gospels were? All of Paul's writings were written before the Gospels, period. Right, before 45, 48 AD, thereabout. But nevertheless, regardless, Paul, does he not say in an offhand remark that we all shall become divine and that we were gods?
I don't remember him that way, but you'd have to send me the reference. Okay, so you would entertain the possibility that history could repeat itself or may have repeated itself, and we just might not be aware of it.
I think that it's possible. Has it happened? Of course, history is not played out that way, but I think it's possible, yes, that a person could live their lives in such a manner that they could be bestowed and adopted, they could be bestowed divinity, and they could thereby become an adopted son of God as well. Yes, I do. But again, history hasn't played that
Yeah.
out.
That's maybe that's an unfair question. I was more concerned about the possible.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Generally, I liked it. I thought it was really well organized. The introduction and the topic's quite interesting. One of the things I was wondering, could you maybe expand a bit more on the scope of chapter 4 about the animals and your emphasis on Derrida and then how that kind of related. I guess maybe more particularly, I would have, if I had the book, I would have just looked at maybe the references to gain some scope, but I think that would interest me, and then how that might work with other religious beliefs for the potential animals.
Interesting. Now, throughout his life, Derrida explored the human animal, non-human animal binary. Right. How that, one of his essays, for example, The Animal That Therefore I Am, More to Follow, in fact, served as a catalyst for the emergent field of animality studies in the last generation. Kerry Wolf, for example, after a short survey of animal studies, claims that Derrida's above highlighted article is the most important event in the history of the animality movement. Mm-hmm. Indeed. Now, I'm not sure I understand your question exactly, Dr. Bridges. Could you rephrase that to me?
Well, I'll ask it a different way. So if we just toss out this idea that humans and like there's something divinely special about humans, or that animals aren't on like a different if we get rid of this idea that animals aren't divine at all, and that humans are God's creation and animals are something else, which I kind of thought you might be doing with the binary, or
oh, no, sir, not at all. I like to I'm trying to deconstruct the binary that Derrida himself deconstructed, if that makes sense, right, so to speak. Right. I contend that humans and other non-human animals are merely different in degree and not kind, to use a Darwinian phrase there, different in degree and not kind. Anyone who has a pussycat for a pet knows it to be true that when you're laying by them at night, they're thinking things just like humans are, but not at that same developmental level. I mean, they play, they enjoy, they reciprocate affection, etc., but not to the same degree that humans do, for example. Right. So yes, I contend that it's only a difference of degree and not kind. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so then how does like do you use any are you just using evolutionary theory, or are you using different religions to support that, or how are you sort of making that?
I'm just using evolutionary theory. Right, yeah. But I think it could be applicable to other religions, but frankly, I'm not as well versed in other religions as I should be to make that argument. And I think if I were able to make that argument, I could do so if I knew more of other religions. But I'm a methodical Catholic, right? Which has also been published recently, by the way. Right. But nevertheless.
So my next question, and this follows, could an animal such as your cat become divinized so that it would also be like God as Jesus?
No, no, not at all, because they don't have the interrelationality that humans do. Humans are unique in their interrelationality and so forth, but we see different degrees of that interrelationality, even in apes, high level apes, bonobos, etc. Right? So, could a bonobo become Christ-like or divinized like Christ? I don't think so, because frankly, they don't have a full human interrelationality. Right, interrelationality.
Well, let me interact with you a little bit on that, because general evolutionary theory says that humans descended from ape-like creatures. So essentially, apes evolved into human beings in some way, ape-like. So they actually became human. So therefore, that implies on some level that potentially they can take another step forward.
I don't deny that at all. I don't deny that at all, because I think that evolution is not through, which is why I say that, you know, Homo sapiens sapiens are the pinnacle at present anyway, right? But at the same time, we must understand that evolution contends that we descended from ape-like creatures, not apes, but ape-like creatures. Okay, that means then that most assuredly they're not in existence anymore, because they died out. That ape-like creature died out, because why? Because humans evolved and then they killed them. Right? They domesticated apes, but they killed the intermediary forms because they were competing for the same niche in nature. So could it happen again? Sure. I guess apes could continue to evolve, but it's not something. Evolution is not something you can monitor on a day-to-day basis or on a year-over-year basis. It takes billions of years for changes to accrue and then thereby be expressed. Hey, baby. Right. Okay.
Talking to your
Although
cat?
I want to give other people a chance, so I'm going to shut up for a minute at least.
Miss
I'll
Marlowe.
jump in if, unless there's someone else. I'll jump in. I really enjoyed reading this and looking through your table of contents. And so I just want to make a couple observations. Just sort of, I'm kind of babbling a little bit here, but it was, what I liked is that you really stimulated thought about a number of, I think, really deep issues for me. And they tend to circle around the main outlines of your project. Like, I'm so fascinated by this idea of reading, doing different readings of, for example, evolutionary theory, and how, in a sense, you're bringing together two, well, more than two, but to oversimplify, two realms of discourse. And that's tricky, but I think it's pretty exciting. And I guess one of my questions would be, I'm trying to determine exactly who your main audience is, or what, because I see you as really inhabiting both realms of discourse, you know, and I think that's where the fruit will, you know, is going to grow out of this project, because you do. But in my experience talking to scientists, and as an example, we had a friend whose family was visiting, and their son is a nuclear physicist at Cornell, a researcher, and he does all this. He's thinking about the cosmos and thinking about, like, really minute level physics, you know. And to me, I got all excited. Oh, wow, you know, just, do you look at the world differently? You know, I wanted to pick his brain apart and figure out, how does this affect his worldview as a person? I mean, he's a scientist, but how does this, it must somehow. And I was a little disappointed, because he basically turned to the very kind of narrow operationalizing of science. Like, in science, we don't really get into that. We may think or enjoy those thoughts, but the science of it is really
focused.
pretty
Right.
focused,
Mhm.
you know. And so I wonder if it always seems to me like in the theology science dialogue that the theologian is more eager to speak to the scientist than vice versa. I mean,
Right.
unless there's some political thing going on, because, you know, there's been tension in some quarters about evolution, for example. Not in every quarter, but it always seems like the theologian or the religious side is more eager to talk to the science side. But what I like about what you're doing is that you show how the religion side, the theological side is really much more nuanced and diverse
Mm.
and deep than what, you know, the public discourse would lead one to
Right.
believe.
Right.
And the same thing with the science. You know, we have kind of, unless we're like you studying biology at some point, you have pretty kind of crude ideas of what the evolutionary process is. But anyway, so I found it really stimulating. And for me, as someone who's sort of a Kantian at the moment, it seems to me
At
that,
the moment or for the last
you
several
know,
years?
I'm ambivalent about it. But one thing that I keep returning to is there's this tension. We all, you know, I mentioned it when I was talking about what I'm trying to do with my own work. We want to grasp the whole.
Mhm.
And, you know, whether it's the notion of the world as a whole, when it began, when it ended, and, you know, we want this vision of continuity and wholeness. And he kept pointing out that, yes, we want that, we're driven for that, but it sets reason at war with itself to try to actually do that. And it struck me as you were talking that evolution, I mean, if you look at different philosophers, some stress continuity and wholeness and grasping the whole. Evolution is totally into the continuous. So when you were talking about, you know, the different animal forms, and when you made that contrast between degree versus kind, you know, humans versus other animals, it's a difference of degree. That is really feeding into this. Yes, there's continuity of life. It's a whole, but it's in such conflict with the medieval worldview where kinds, you know, are kind of paramount, you
Right.
know, establishing the kinds and the chain of being, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I'm babbling a
It's
little.
against Neoplatonic thought, right?
Yeah, I mean, I am babbling, I realize, but it's very interesting to me, like the tensions and which I think are fertile, you know, or could be a fertile source of, I could see where, you know, this sort of blossomed into all these chapters. And as John suggested, it may be more books, you know, so yeah. So I don't know if you could want to speak to the idea of grasping the whole and how you see in, in getting into this dialogue, how the religious side might change, or vice versa. I think less likely that the scientists will kind of alter their perspective, or I don't know. What do you see there as possible?
Well, I contend, I do contend indeed that in this relationship between theology and science, theology will have to make the most modification.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right? But at the same time, a scientist could choose to not pontificate outside of their areas,
Mm-hmm.
for example, right? I mean, Daniel Dennett is notorious for this.
Yeah.
Notorious. I mean, he takes his science and then he expands it out and takes it to areas that shouldn't be
Yeah.
expounded upon, frankly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that religion or theology again would have to do the most adapting, but nevertheless, in order to make their theologizing amongst a scientifically somewhat literate culture,
Mm-hmm.
we've got to change in order to
Yeah.
reach the people of today.
Yeah.
Right, but I wish that scientists, qua scientists, would stay more in their domain
Yeah.
and not expand outward. Right, because as you say, your friend there,
Yeah.
he or she focuses on what they do. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And
I still, you know, I still want to press, and I still wonder, for example, the evolutionist, the biologist must, I mean, because they're thinking this all the time, must have a sense of the unity of life. And that's not science per se, that's worldview. I mean, so science and worldview are two different things, yet science itself could be called a worldview, and it can lead to a worldview in a positive way. I mean, if you think about like our ecological, crises, etc., certainly being steeped in that evolutionary and sort of the big picture view of the unity of all life forms must have an effect on the person beyond their science in a way that's linked to their experience in science but isn't really within the domain of science. I don't know. So I wonder about those things. But the physicist friend was unsatisfactory.
Miss Mary Kay, you had two questions, and I meant to go back to the first one, but
you got to them. You got to them, but I did have another thought that, first of all, I loved the way your introduction was laid out, because I haven't obviously read the book, but at least I have an understanding of where you're going and what you're trying to do. And I think from an academic standpoint, somebody who wanted to use your book to teach with, that introduction is a really good sales pitch for several different courses where your book might be used. I think what occurred to me is that your section on animality might lend itself to eco-theology, people that are interested in that and might want to be looking at what you're saying to promote that whole concept of, the higher ordered thinking of, certain animals and how we should be treating them as human beings and stewards of the planet. And so that's just one example, but I think that's kind of an important topic that needs not to be maybe that's another book, but I think that and maybe talking to engaging in eco-theology a little bit might help you on another book. But I think taking a stab at it here and doing such in-depth work on it is a really good thing.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that coming from you. I appreciate it indeed to do. I'm sure Saskia has a burning question.
I'm not sure if it's burning, but I think it's a simple one. But I did not get really what you mean with uncontrolled love of God. And why is it uncontrolled? Is it the same like unconditioned? And for whom is it uncontrolled? For us, for nature, I don't got the connection.
That's an interesting question. For the last decade or more now, Thomas J. Ord has focused upon in writing and developing his ideas of the uncontrolling love of God, the uncontrolling love of God, right? Meaning that God loves with reckless abandon. He does not I guess insist upon particular outcomes to him giving love to creatures or to animals and so forth like that. And as a result of such, God does not control the results of that given love, I guess in a sense. It's uncontrolling, totally reckless and overflowing, right? God does not bestow upon us love, for example, in order to make us more righteous. He just does it because that's part of his nature. His nature is love, and as a result, he imparts love to us. And that, of course, he might have some sort of an intention, if I might transfer such a concept to God, for us to respond in such a way that might make us more loving people or more loving entities or what have you. But nevertheless, he does not insist upon controlling. It's uncontrolling. Not uncontrolled, but uncontrolling. Yes, ma'am. Right.
Is it then for God uncontrolling as well as for us?
Interesting. In what sense do you mean exactly? So you're transferring back the love onto God, correct? Did I understand you correctly? Okay.
Yeah.
So, for example, I believe that Jesus of Nazareth, after he was adopted into the deity, expresses uncontrolling love because God the Father, if you will, and I'm just going to use that old terminology, God the Father, bestowed upon Jesus an uncontrolling love that he gave back to God, in so much as he, of course, offered himself as a pristine and perfect sacrifice for all the massive men and women. But notice here, Jesus did not do this entirely 100% willingly. What I mean by that is this: he was uncontrolling because he, of course, on the cross, if we take the gospels, synoptic gospels, as literal, you know what have you, does he not say, "My God, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani"? My God, why have you forsaken me? He uncontrollingly responded to that love, even though it was against his will. He uncontrollingly responded to that love of God and passed it back to God the Father, if you will. Does that sufficiently answer that question?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Right.
Okay. I had a quick question, if it's okay.
Dr. Bridges, yes, sir.
So I try to remain agnostic and have an open mind to a lot of things. One of the things that sort of troubles me about trying to comprehend what you're saying is I wish that we had another species on Earth that had religion. And I think that would help me understand how this relationship between religion and evolution works. And I was sort of wondering, if we encounter like an extraterrestrial species that isn't more advanced than us, and they had religion, what would you see as the merit of their religion versus our religion?
That's a great question. And I would like to say that certain bonobos and apes have been viewed under of course camera to do things akin to religious sacrifice as well as religious memorials and so forth. So there's a vicariousness there of the idea of a sort of a religious mentality being expressed in bonobos and higher level apes, right? But so I think we could look at what their primitive religiosity might be, and we could see foundations there for us. But with regard to extraterrestrial species, which we're going to find, by the way, it's just a matter of time, right? Right. But would they be religious in what sense would they be religious? Well, would they worship the same God? That I think I'll lay my cards on the table. I think that the God of Israel, as expressed in the Abrahamic religions, and then even in the Baha'i faith and so forth like that, is the supreme God of all. But that's a faith concept. That's not something that I can demonstrate empirically. Does that make sense? Right. So, but I do think that he is the God of all. So I would like to presume then that if God took it upon himself to manifest himself on this little small speck in our solar system known as Earth, that he would manifest himself to some degree to other worlds, if there be such. I mean, other galaxies, if you will, right? And even perhaps even in our own world, right? And he would manifest himself in such a degree that if they're Martians, he would become a Martian. He'd be a little green thing, you know. But even though Martians are not green, you know, but we commonly think of them as green. What I'm trying to get at there is that God would manifest himself in the manner that would be respectable and also conducive to the culture at hand. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Could I ask, so suppose this alien race, they've solved a lot of the problems. They don't have war. They their planet is flourishing, would we do well to convert to their religion?
Oh, that's an interesting assertion. Perhaps we could divvy up moral precepts from law, if you will. Perhaps if we do encounter another species of some organic based life, because that's really all the life that we know of in the world. We have no way of supposing that there's non-organic life. And what I mean by organic is that it's based upon the organic chemistry, carbon based. So apparently all the life that we know of is carbon based. So if we encountered some of the carbon based life and they had more morality than we did, I would suspect that we would not have to convert to their religious ideas, but we could incorporate their morality, if you will, incorporate that into our own religion and so forth, make it more manifest. Because frankly, I cannot conceive of a religion higher than Jesus of Nazareth, who told us, to, of course, love others as you love yourself. I think that to be the preeminent principle in all of reality. So, yeah, I mean, we can incorporate their moral characters, but I wouldn't foresee myself having to convert to their faith. Because I mean, if we look at it today, Buddhism has some pretty awesome. Buddhism, for example, I'm not a convert to Buddhism at all, but Buddhism does teach very good truth regarding humanity being the cause of our own suffering. The problem lies with us, not with our environment. The problem lies with us. I think that I can appropriate that in my daily life and realize that I'm the source of my own suffering most often. Some external events happen, but I'm the source of my suffering because of the way I respond to events in my life and so forth like that. And that's something that Buddhism teaches, but I'm not a convert to Buddhism, but I can nevertheless lift from Buddhism that principle, for example. Does that make sense to you, Dr. Bridges?
Yeah, no, I like that response. Yeah, thank you for.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for taking the question too. I know it's an odd question. Not sure what happened to John. And there's any other questions that people have? Yeah, no, thank you again. And I really enjoyed how it was presented and the scope of it as well.
Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate the audience. Whenever I present, y'all always refine me in some way, and I appreciate that. Truly, challenge me and refine me. I like that. Thank you again.
No problem.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Okay, and I will end it. I think you'll stop recording, and then you can get it from Grant. Or
he's gonna have to like literally download it, like he or you probably could, like the way when I teach on a Zoom class, it automatically will tell you that it's gonna compress the thing. So just make sure you don't like lose the recording by, I remember, I don't remember if everybody else leaves and you have to stay or whatever, but when you leave the meeting, the recording will just like automatically load onto somebody's computer, like whoever is.
I think you'll be Grant.
Yeah, you have to let it though.
Okay.
Well, thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good week.
You too.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye. Nice to see you all.
I didn't get to speak about my week here. My week has been nothing but memorization. This is the third week I've lost with memorization. I hate this. We're in a paradigm that's a relic of a bygone era. I've been memorizing stuff that I want to forget anyway. I hate
When
that.
is your calls?
7/16.
Okay, so not too much longer.
No, not too much longer. No. All right.
But yeah, no, it is annoying. But
thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.